The system of prisoner-of-war camp inspections during the Second World War was grounded in obligations established by international law, particularly the provisions of the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Among the mechanisms designed to ensure compliance with these standards, inspections conducted by neutral humanitarian organizations, most notably the International Committee of the Red Cross, played a central role. These inspections were intended to provide an external evaluation of conditions inside detention facilities, including housing, medical treatment, food distribution, sanitation, and administrative procedures governing the custody of captured personnel. Although the effectiveness of these inspections varied depending on the circumstances of each conflict zone and the cooperation of the detaining power, the system represented one of the few structured attempts to apply international scrutiny to wartime detention practices under the 1929 Geneva Convention. Detaining powers were obligated to allow representatives of neutral organizations to visit prisoner-of-war camps. Article provisions emphasized that such representatives should have permission to inspect all premises occupied by prisoners and to speak with detainees without witnesses. These visits were intended not merely as symbolic gestures, but as practical oversight mechanisms through which inspectors could observe living conditions, verify administrative compliance with international standards, and report their findings to both the detaining state and the broader international community. The International Committee of the Red Cross developed a systematic approach to these inspections. Delegates assigned to conduct visits were typically trained in both humanitarian law and administrative evaluation. Their task involved assessing whether camps adhered to requirements concerning accommodation, hygiene, nutrition, labor conditions, and medical care. Delegates prepared detailed written reports that were transmitted confidentially to the detaining government and, when appropriate, to the government of the prisoner's origin. The intention behind this reporting structure was to encourage improvements through diplomatic channels rather than through public condemnation. In the case of camps holding female prisoners of war, the legal framework remained fundamentally the same, though certain provisions of the Geneva Convention acknowledged that women prisoners required particular considerations regarding housing, supervision, and medical treatment. The convention stipulated that female prisoners should be accommodated separately from male prisoners and should be under the immediate supervision of women whenever possible. These provisions were designed to maintain order and protect the physical security of detainees while also reflecting prevailing assumptions about gender roles within military and civilian institutions of the period. Red Cross delegates visiting camps that housed female prisoners often began their inspections by meeting with camp commandants and administrative officers. During these meetings, the delegates would review official records, including prisoner registers, medical logs, and supply inventories. These documents provided an initial framework through which inspectors could assess whether the camp administration was maintaining the records required under the convention. Accurate record-keeping was considered a critical aspect of compliance, as it ensured that prisoners could be accounted for, that deaths or transfers were documented, and that communication with families through Red Cross channels could be maintained. Following this administrative review, inspectors typically conducted a physical tour of the camp facilities. Housing areas were examined to determine whether barracks met the convention's requirements for space, ventilation, and protection from weather conditions. Inspectors paid particular attention to sanitation infrastructure, including latrines, bathing facilities, and waste disposal systems. These elements were considered essential for preventing outbreaks of disease in densely populated camps. Food distribution was another central component of inspection reports. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive rations, equivalent in quantity and quality to those provided to the detaining power's own troops stationed in the same region. Red Cross delegates therefore evaluated both the quantity of food issued and the logistical systems used to prepare and distribute meals. In some camps, inspectors observed kitchens directly, noting the condition of cooking equipment, the availability of fuel, and the organization of prisoner work details. Responsible for food preparation. Medical oversight formed a particularly important aspect of Red Cross inspections. The convention stipulated that camps must maintain infirmaries, staffed by qualified medical personnel capable of providing treatment for illness and injury. Delegates examined these facilities to determine whether they were adequately equipped and whether prisoners had reasonable access to medical attention. Inspectors also reviewed medical registers that documented diagnoses, treatments, and transfers to hospitals when necessary. In one documented case from a camp holding female military personnel captured during operations in Eastern Europe, a Red Cross delegate requested to examine the infirmary's patient records during a scheduled inspection. The camp physician presented a ledger containing entries for several detainees receiving treatment for respiratory infections during the winter months. Among these entries was the record of a young auxiliary communications operator who had been admitted with symptoms of severe bronchitis. The delegate requested permission to speak with the patient privately in order to confirm that she had received appropriate care and that her condition had been properly documented. Such conversations formed a routine part of inspections, allowing delegates to verify administrative claims through direct observation and discussion. During the conversation, the prisoner confirmed that she had been transferred to the infirmary shortly after reporting persistent coughing and fever. She described the treatment she had received, including rest, medication, and additional rations intended to support recovery. The delegate noted these statements in the inspection report, comparing them with the physician's written records and with the general condition of the infirmary facilities. While the case itself did not represent a major institutional failure or success, it illustrated the type of individual evaluation through which inspectors attempted to confirm that administrative systems were functioning as required by international law. After examining housing areas, medical facilities, and supply systems, Red Cross delegates usually requested the opportunity to speak with groups of prisoners without the presence of camp guards. These discussions allowed detainees to raise concerns regarding working conditions, correspondence with families, disciplinary procedures, or shortages of essential supplies. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be allowed to communicate grievances to inspecting authorities, and inspectors documented these complaints for inclusion in their final reports. In camps holding female prisoners, inspectors sometimes paid particular attention to the organization of daily routines. Many detainees were assigned to work details within the camp itself, such as kitchen duties, laundry services, or clerical tasks assisting camp administration. In some circumstances, prisoners were also assigned to labor detachments outside the camp, though the Geneva Convention restricted the types of work that could be required. Inspectors reviewed these assignments to determine whether they complied with legal limitations on labor conditions, including restrictions against work directly related to military operations. Another component of inspection involved evaluating communication systems between prisoners and the outside world. The Red Cross had established a global network for the transmission of prisoner correspondence and information about captured personnel. Camps were expected to maintain records, enabling prisoners to send letters and receive parcels from families or relief organizations. Inspectors examined these processes to ensure that prisoners' rights to communication were being respected, and that mail censorship procedures did not exceed the limitations permitted by international agreements. In addition to evaluating conditions within individual camps, Red Cross inspections also served a broader diplomatic function. Inspection reports were compiled into centralized records that allowed the organization to compare conditions across different detention systems operated by various belligerent states. These comparisons were used to encourage reciprocal improvements. If one state received reports indicating deficiencies in its camps, It could be reminded that similar scrutiny might be applied to camps, holding its own captured personnel elsewhere. The reporting process itself was carefully structured to maintain neutrality. Red Cross delegates avoided language that might be interpreted as direct accusations, instead presenting their observations in formal administrative terms. Reports typically included descriptions of facilities, summaries of prisoner interviews, and recommendations for improvements. These recommendations might address issues such as increasing heating fuel during winter months, improving ventilation in overcrowded barracks, or expanding medical supplies within camp infirmaries. Female prisoner camps presented certain administrative questions that inspectors needed to address within the existing legal framework. Although the Geneva Convention did not contain extensive gender-specific provisions, it did emphasize that women prisoners should receive treatment consistent with their status, and that their accommodation should reflect considerations of privacy and security. Inspectors therefore assessed whether sleeping quarters were properly segregated and whether supervision arrangements complied with the expectation that female personnel would oversee housing areas when possible. Medical inspections also considered issues relating specifically to women's health. Camp infirmaries were expected to maintain basic capabilities for addressing conditions that might arise among female detainees, including access to appropriate sanitary supplies and the presence of medical staff capable of addressing gender-specific health concerns. Delegates recorded whether such provisions were available and whether they were distributed regularly through camp supply systems. Despite the formal structure of inspections, the degree to which they could fully reveal conditions inside camps depended heavily on the cooperation of the detaining authorities. In some cases, inspectors were granted extensive access and were able to conduct thorough evaluations. In other situations, the scope of inspections was more limited, with certain areas or records presented selectively by camp administrators. Red Cross delegates were aware of these limitations and often relied on cross-checking information obtained from different sources within the camp. For example, if official records indicated that a camp maintained a certain level of food rationing, inspectors might verify this claim by observing meal distribution and by speaking with prisoners about their daily diet. Similarly, medical logs could be compared with the visible condition of patients in infirmaries to determine whether treatment records accurately reflected the health situation within the camp. In camps holding female prisoners, the role of prisoner representatives also became an important point of interaction during inspections. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to elect spokespersons responsible for communicating with camp authorities and visiting inspectors. These representatives could present collective concerns regarding housing conditions, work assignments, or the availability of supplies. Red Cross delegates often met privately with such representatives to obtain an organized overview of prisoner perspectives. Another administrative element evaluated during inspections was the system for handling disciplinary measures. The Geneva Convention permitted certain forms of punishment for violations of camp regulations, but established limits on their severity and duration. Inspectors reviewed disciplinary records to ensure that punishments were recorded properly and that prisoners retained the rights granted under international law, including access to medical care and adequate living conditions, even while under disciplinary restriction. The logistical scale of Red Cross inspection activity during the Second World War was considerable. Delegates conducted thousands of visits to prisoner-of-war camps across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Each visit generated detailed documentation that contributed to an expanding archive of information about wartime detention systems. Within this network of inspections, camps holding female prisoners constituted a smaller but significant category requiring the same level of institutional scrutiny. Presence of neutral inspectors sometimes influenced the behavior of camp administrations. Commandants were aware that inspection reports would be reviewed, by both international organizations and their own governments. As a result, preparations were often made prior to scheduled visits, including the organization of records and the maintenance of facilities. While such preparations did not necessarily reflect everyday conditions within the camp, they nevertheless demonstrated the regulatory pressure created by the possibility of external oversight for prisoners themselves. The arrival of inspectors represented one of the few opportunities to communicate directly with representatives of a neutral authority. Even when these interactions were brief and conducted within the formal structure of inspection procedures, they served as a reminder that the legal status of prisoners was recognized within the broader framework of international law. The case of the communications operator examined earlier illustrates the practical nature of these interactions. From the perspective of the inspector, the evaluation of a single medical case functioned as a verification step within a larger administrative process. The goal was not to intervene directly in individual treatment decisions, but to determine whether the systems governing medical care were operating in accordance with established regulations. By comparing patient testimony, medical records, and the physical condition of the infirmary, inspectors attempted to form a measured assessment of institutional compliance. In the final stage of each visit, Red Cross delegates compiled their observations into formal inspection reports. These documents summarized the conditions observed during the inspection and identified any issues requiring attention by the detaining authorities. Reports were transmitted through diplomatic channels, and in many cases governments responded with written explanations or descriptions of corrective measures undertaken. After the inspection, the cumulative effect of these reports contributed to an evolving body of documentation that informed both wartime diplomacy and post-war evaluations of detention practices. Although the inspection system could not eliminate all abuses or ensure uniform compliance with international law, it provided a structured mechanism through which conditions inside prisoner of war camps could be observed and recorded by neutral parties within camps holding female prisoners. This oversight system functioned in much the same way as it did in camps holding male detainees. Inspectors evaluated housing arrangements, sanitation, nutrition, medical treatment, labor conditions, and administrative record-keeping according to the same legal standards. Individual cases, such as the medical evaluation of the communications operator, served as practical points of reference within a broader institutional review. By documenting these conditions and transmitting their findings through diplomatic channels, Red Cross inspectors sought to maintain a level of international scrutiny over wartime detention systems. The process reflected the underlying premise of the Geneva Convention, that even during armed conflict, the treatment of captured personnel should be subject to rules, documentation, and oversight. Through inspections, reports, and administrative follow-up, these oversight systems attempted to regulate the management of prisoner of war camps and to impose a framework of legal accountability on the realities of wartime detention.